It's funny because I was one of the guys who might have been critical of that kind of comparison earlier in his career, because we're just so quick to latch on to guys, new guys coming up, and want to assign them a kind of greatness comparison. We want to put them in context with other big fight promoters of the day, but it really comes down to, when the scrutiny gets big and the pressures are there and the doubts surmount, I feel like he steps up his game. And there's something about that mentality was really what Muhammad Ali was all about. Obviously, Muhammad Ali was coming from a whole different climate, and there was, there was a lot of turmoil in the world when he was when going through it with the war and everything else. But in this instance, I just feel like each time there is added scrutiny, added pressure, added magnitude, we see Conor McGregor show up in rarer and rarer form, not just meeting an expectation, because that's very difficult to do where he's put himself, but actually exceeding those expectations, both in the fight, in the lead up to the fight, and usually come fight night. So in my mind, he is definitely doing that. I think he's tailor-made for promotion and tailor-made for that kind of greatness. I feel like guys who are on top of the game have a much looser sense of how long they want to stand, because they're still dictating their own terms. I think that everything is still dancing to their tune at that point. Now, what happens if he loses? That's the question. Does he then want to keep going to regain the thing that he lost? And I feel like Conor McGregor strikes me as the guy who might go through that kind of transition if he starts to lose some of that luster. I don't think the money is going to dictate everything for him. I think that he craves that kind of attention. You have to crave that kind of attention to uphold your responsibilities to the point he does, and to flourish in that kind of scrutiny. So I think that if he loses, we could end up seeing him, for years to come. If he wins, I still think we'll see him probably in, big fights, like the type of big fights that may not make sense to titles and things like that. They'll just be big fights that make sense to Conor McGregor at that point. But the loss is really where I'm like, once you see a guy lose, I think is when you start to see how long they really want to go.
Well, that's very true. And I think when he says this week that it's not about the money for him anymore, like, a lot of people aren't buying that. There's a big part of me that does buy that. And there is a big part of me that Conor McGregor, when he listens to conversations like the idea that you mentioned, that you started to think that he is resembling Muhammad Ali in certain ways of his character, that sort of stuff really does matter to Conor McGregor, that there is a legacy of Conor McGregor. And if we just revisit the Ali comparison for just one moment, what did Muhammad Ali have in his career? Well, he had fantastic rivalries. And I mean, a Khabib rematch, given how, if this fight is a classic, say, on Saturday, would be something that would create a rivalry straight away. We already have a great modern rivalry with Nate Diaz, a trilogy there. We're turning that into a classic modern rivalry, and suddenly you start to tick another one of the Muhammad Ali boxes.
Yes, 100%, man. I agree with you 100%. And we always look at the golden age of our heavyweights in boxing in the 70s, and man, you're absolutely right. The way it was constructed, there were, multiple good, very capable, very strong and dangerous people all at the top. Well, that's kind of the setup we're dealing in, especially for a guy like McGregor, who can fight in multiple weight classes and actually has the clout to lobby for and possibly develop for himself the 165-pound weight class when it's all said and done. I think that all of that combined, man, he is set up to do whatever he wants. But he's already. I think that Diaz fight sits out there glaring, to be taken up and to finish out. So that trilogy will happen at some point. And obviously, this Nurmagomedov, just depending on how it goes, though, if Nurmagomedov goes out there and gets smoked in the first round, kind of like Jose Aldo did, that's not a rivalry anymore. I think he puts the Nurmagomedov thing behind him. But if the fight is really contested, and especially if he loses a close fight, or it's a back and forth war or something like that, you're absolutely right, man. I think that Nurmagomedov fits that bill 100% to give him an ongoing rivalry throughout the rest of his career.
That's interesting, Chuck. Just on the comparison with, say, the golden era of heavyweight boxing, but there's also the issue here that kind of McGregor's a linchpin and all that. If he steps away now, is the McGregor-shaped hole in the UFC bigger than ever? Are they more reliant than ever on McGregor?
That's a good question, man. This week is very telling. I know the very first piece I worked on for The Ringer is really about like what this means. What does this fight mean? How pivotal is it for the UFC? It's very difficult to forecast. But I do know one thing. I mean, 2.5 million, if that's really the projected total, you have to think, like, if you added up all the pay-per-views of 2018, it falls short of 2.5 million. It's like one event makes up for a mediocre slate for, 9-10 months or whatever it is. To me, that's the kind of thing that is just very different. We're not used to it. We're not used to trying to figure out what a guy of that magnitude means. A guy who literally is admired and resented at the same time by everybody on the roster because he's able to accomplish what he does. His greatness is complicated.